Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week is the Eventide Instant Flanger Mark II. This is a revision of the original Eventide Flanger plugin released by Eventide Audio. So the Instant Flanger plugin, excuse me. So what you have is a very similar look here, but with some updated, a much higher grade emulation of the original hardware. They've also brought in a few extra features that don't exist on the original emulation or on the original hardware. But this is an incredible piece. This was originally released in 1976. If you're also familiar with the Eventide Phaser, the Mark II, which is also released recently by, as of this video time anyway, by Eventide. That was released in 1971, so this was about 5 years later. And the purpose, or the design purpose of this, was to emulate the effect of a tape flange. Now, tape flanging is sort of an intricate process, but more or less, believe it or not, the simplicity of applying it is really just grabbing onto the reel while the tape is running through the tape machine, which slows down the tape machine. And the way that you grab onto the reel or push your hand against the reel to sort of slow it down, the rate at which you slow it down is what creates the flange. Now, the way flange effects work is that you need a mix of the dry signal along with the modulated signal in order for the effect to happen. So what it does is it creates a delay. And if you change that delay, then what happens is that shifting delay then creates a filtering movement. It's actually kind of a comb filtering thing. If you think about like a 1 kilohertz tone, a 1 kilohertz tone is about 1 millisecond. It's a little more than that. It's like 1.1 milliseconds. So if we just say 1 millisecond for simplicity, so what that means is that if you have a delay of 1 millisecond on the exact same signal, 1 kilohertz will be perfectly in phase. But 500 hertz will be completely out of phase. And as you go through the cycle, as you go through the different frequencies, 2K will be in phase, 3K will be in phase, 4K will be in phase, and all the 500s in between will be out of phase. And so you get this sort of sweeping, like comb filtering effect that occurs. So now if you change that millisecond delay time and start shifting it back and forth, then those frequency shifts along with it. And that's what you get when you hear this sort of sweeping filter effect. So some people do a thing where they just take a filter. There are lots of plugins that do this. It's used a lot in EDM music, where you just take a filter with a very sharp cue, and then you just sort of sweep it, and you got a similar type of effect. So what Eventide did here is very different from what you get in a lot of sort of stock flanger plugins that you find that are just sort of digital flanger plugins, because it has many more things or features that are added in that are kind of unique and what really make this kind of work in a very powerful way. So what we have here is, we'll just kind of go through some of the features. We have the toolbar up here, so you can load, save, compare. You got settings, it just shows the values if you want to sort of see the values displayed on the knobs, that type of thing. I'll kind of leave that off for right now. Information button, and then you could load up presets and all of that sort of stuff. There are some modes here. Now, the original hardware actually had two outputs. It had a main output and an auxiliary output. The primary difference was in, just like the phaser, it's what's called a bucket brigade delay. So what you're using is a series of capacitors, and the signal jumps from capacitor to capacitor with a certain timing. And so the total number of those end up leading to a certain amount of delay. But you can double that. And so if you run through both of them, you're running out of the main output. If you run through just one of those pairings of the bucket brigade delay, then that's the auxiliary output. So the timing of them is slightly off from each other. So the modes here work along those lines. So if you're shallow, then you're only using the auxiliary output. So that's the shortest delay time. If you're deep, then you're using a slightly longer delay time, and that's the main output only. And then if you use wide, then it feeds the main output to the left speaker and the auxiliary output to the right speaker. So you're actually getting two different delay times and the flange. Now, these are very short delays, so it's not as if you're not getting you're not getting like this slapback kind of sound. You hear kind of a little bit of it with some percussion and those types of things, but that just so you have a basic understanding of what that feature is, because it is important to the way that you work it. So the main settings are all here. This puts the flanger into circuit or bypasses it. You have an effects modifier. So this is sort of interesting. This is sort of like the Doppler effect, which is the pitch shifting and movement. And the bounce control is sort of what happens when you sort of rub against the wheel or slow down the reel of the tape machine. When you let it go, it'll sort of bounce back, which creates a little warble effect, and that can be kind of cool. And that's what this bounce is. It's a sort of every, based on the modulation, it will put that this little warble effect right in there, which is kind of cool. So I'll show you how that works and how to listen for it, know what it is exactly. There's an oscillator. So there's 4 different ways that you can modulate the delays. One is just a standard oscillator. So this is just a thing where it sweeps back and forth. This is the type of thing you see on every digital flanger type of thing, where you just have basically a low frequency oscillator and you set it to whatever frequency. The cool thing here is we can switch it to work in musical values, bars or beats or whatever, so the modulation occurs over a musical timing. And then there's also a retrigger here, which is kind of cool. So this is something that you can automate in so that when you get to the downbeat of a bar or a pattern or whatever, it retriggers so it always starts from the same place. And this can be great if you're working on a mix and you sort of want a pattern to start in a particular place. You can retrigger it so the pattern starts on a certain phase cycle of the oscillator as it moves through. There's a manual control. So this is something if you kick it in, then you could just sort of modulate it on your own. So you could just grab this and sort of move it and wiggle it around and change on your own. Right? You could actually use both of them together. So you would have this going on, and then relatively you would be moving this, so they all interact with each other. You have a feedback control, so you could feedback the output of the delay back into the front end and through the flanging. So, and if you invert the phase of it, you can create some really cool effects too. So this is very powerful. And then you have an envelope follower. So when you're working with this and you put this in, what will happen is it will respond to the input gain of the signal. Okay, so the amplitude form of modulation. So it'll modulate based on amplitude. And so you have a threshold, and then you have a release time, which is how long the flange effect will basically occur when it kicks in. So you can kind of create some cool effects this way if you're working with it, where it sort of flanges according to the input signal. This can work really well with vocals. Now, you can use any of these in combination. Now, actually, I've pointed out 3 modulations. The 4th modulation actually involves using a remote. So if you use a remote, then the way that this on the original hardware would connect in with a 1/4-inch connector, so you could feed something else in to sort of key the modulation. Here, if you connect a MIDI keyboard and you connect it will connect the modulation wheel, and you can use the modulation wheel to affect the way the flange gets. So you could actually turn it into a performance. And once you have that modulation wheel movement programmed in onto a MIDI track, feed it in, and you're good to go. You could also have an external key come in here. So you could feed an external bus in there and use the side chain as the input signal that triggers the modulation. So you have a number of ways to work with it. You have an output control for gain. You have an input control just to see if you're overloading it. There's a limit light here that'll show you if you're clipping, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's make some noise here. Let's just start with a standard sort of oscillator here and kind of go through this and also show you the oscillator effect here. So. So you hear that little wheep, like kind of that goes in there. That's what the bounce back is. The subtle effect, like every 2 bars is going to kind of put like this little, kind of little warp kind of into the sound. So it's subtle. The Doppler effect here, you can actually change the amount or depth of it. So you can kind of play around with that along with the bounce. That gives you some options there. And then of course here you're just changing the time. Make it occur over a much longer time. Let me switch it back to 2 bars here. So if I switch the mode here to shallow, we should get a tighter delay. So that creates a shorter delay, right? Half the size of delay. This is going to be a little more slapbacky. And then this is going to split it between the speakers. So it gives you almost a slightly different effect between the 2 sides, just so that you're aware. So that's just the oscillator, just working with that. It's pretty straightforward. Here we have this allows you to kind of do it by hand, right? To sort of create or move the modulation by hand. Right, so if you want to just sort of do like a sort of performance pattern, you could do a similar thing with a modulation wheel where you kind of dig into it that way. And again, if you want it to be tighter, you could work with the shallow mode. You know, so you could like get into some pretty dramatic effects, which is kind of cool. The feedback also plays a role in this. If I go back here, you know, I could just put a little feedback. So if I have a little modulation here, we could sort of make this screech a little bit here by bringing some feedback. Oh, this is inverted, so let me just... So you can hear how like that feedback like starts to create all kinds of other patterns. It's like you're almost turning it into like a completely different sound, you know, from what it is. And these are cool things like if you just want to even just put it in like some sort of transitional section, you can, you know, create some pretty creative kind of cool effects. The other one here you have is the Modulation Follower. Maybe I'll kind of mix in a little bit of the lead vocal here. Let me just see if I'm queued up to a verse here with some vocals here. Let's just see what this sort of sounds like here. And we'll start with these settings and let's just see what happens here.
Tired of the sunshine, tired of the straight line, time to just let it go. Tired of the politics, tired of the hypocrites, man, you just never know. I'm tired of the way it feels, is it fake or is it real? So tired of letting go. Well, is it too damn hard or is it too damn soft? Well, man, you just never know. And I hate everything about you. And you hate everything, I know you do.
So with the right sound, I'm not sure that this is like the right kind of vocal or the right thing to do, but with the right sound, you can kind of create some cool effects here. The release time is important because that's the time over which the flange occurs once it kind of crosses over the threshold. So that control ends up being important. Now you could use all of these in combination to create all kinds of other crazy effects. So you can set up like some kind of basic sound and then do a little modulation wheel programming to get it, figure out the amount of feedback. I think you can get a really good sense just from this, like how many options of all different kinds of sounds that you can really get into with this. Plus you can go through, you know, and load up presets if you're looking for, you know, different types of effects, things that are very intense. metallic sounding that usually has like a lot of feedback in it. And then there are the artists presets that go in here, and these things have just like just a ton of uses on different things for just sort of crazy, whether transitional effects or some particular guitar effect or whatever that you want to sound sort of psychedelic, a particular track or something like that. A really great one, a really great. I love the hardware, original hardware unit, and working with it. This is a fantastic emulation and a really powerful creative tool in the studio. So I'm really happy that Eventide went ahead and released this update as well, along with the Instant Phaser. The combination of the two is really spectacular. So there you have it. Eventide Instant Flanger Mark II, latest from Eventide, and it's Mixing with Mike's plugin of the week.